The wind over the high plains of Wyoming was a blade whetted on stone, and Jonas felt it in the marrow of his bones. It was a wind that stripped the world to its essentials: rock, ice, and the skeletal remains of cottonwood trees, clawing at a sky the color of a fresh bruise. He'd come to this forgotten corner of the world to be stripped bare himself, to let the silence and the cold scour the stain from his soul. But the past was a stubborn ghost, and his was etched into the very land he stood upon. He was on the ridge, the one he always came back to, a place of masochistic pilgrimage. Below, the valley unspooled, a cradle of snow-dusted sage where the Gray Bull River made a silver scar through the land. Years ago, he had ridden through that valley in a blue coat, the brass buttons winking like cruel, indifferent eyes. He remembered the smell of gunpowder and burning hides, a smell that still woke him in the deep of night, his heart a panic drum against his ribs. He had been part of a mechanism of erasure, a single cog in a machine of righteous slaughter. He had not pulled a trigger that day, a refusal that had cost him his uniform and earned him the brand of coward, but his silence had been its own kind of violence. He had watched, he had done nothing. And so he was here, in self-imposed exile, a man haunted by the ghosts of a people he had helped to scatter. He was checking his snares, the small loops of wire a meager hedge against starvation, when he saw it, a splash of color against the white and gray of the riverbank below. Not the dun brown of a deer or the gray of a wolf, but a deep, impossible crimson staining the snow. It was wrong. It was a wound in the landscape. His breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the frigid air. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and regret, screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to his small, smoke-choked cabin and bolt the door, to see nothing, to know nothing. But the man who had done nothing once before could not do it again. The weight of that old failure was an anchor, and it dragged him down the treacherous, scree-littered slope. As he drew closer, the scene resolved into a nightmare. It was a girl, a native girl, no older than 14 or 15 summers. She was curled on her side at the edge of the half-frozen creek, one hand trailing in the water as if trying to wash away the pain. She wore a simple doeskin dress, now dark and stiff with blood from a ragged gash on her side, a wound that looked like a kiss from a hunter's skinning knife. A heavy, blue cavalry coat too large, grotesquely familiar lay discarded a few feet away, a vulture's shadow on the snow. Her hair was a river of black silk against the ice, and her face, when he knelt beside her, was a mask of serene exhaustion. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her features fine and sharp, etched with a dignity that defied the butchery inflicted upon her. She was not crying. Her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow, hitching whisper. Jonas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was not a random act of wilderness cruelty. This was the work of men. The kind of men who stalked the fringes of the territories, men who saw a native girl as little more than sport, a piece of flesh to be used and discarded. The coat was the proof, a trophy taken and then abandoned. He looked up, scanning the ridgelines, the dense stands of pine. The world was utterly still, utterly silent. No hoofbeats, no voices, only the mournful cry of a red-tailed hawk circling. High in the thermals, a lonely god surveying a world of casual brutality. He was alone with her. To help her was to invite the wrath of whatever monsters had done this. To leave her was to become one of them. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers clumsy with cold and fear, and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, deep and dark as a starless night, holding a universe of pain and history. There was no fear in them, only a profound, bottomless weariness. Her lips parted, chapped and pale. A single word escaped, a breath of sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. It was not a plea for help. It was not his name. It was a name spoken in the Lakota tongue, a name he did not understand but felt in his soul. It sounded like a pronouncement, a judgment, a prophecy. Wangbli. Eagle. Then her eyes closed, and the only sound was the hawk's cry fading into the vast, unforgiving silence. He had chosen. He had touched her. And in that touch, he had sealed his fate. He gathered her into his arms, the slight weight of her a profound burden, and started the long climb back to his shelter, the blood from her wound seeping into his worn coat, binding them together in a covenant of violence and unlikely grace. His cabin was a single room, built of rough-hewn pine, chinked with mud and moss. It smelled of wood smoke, solitude, and the faint, lingering scent of remorse. It was a hermit's den, a place to hide from the world and from himself. Now it was a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of warmth against the encroaching wilderness. He laid her on his own cot, a rough frame strung with rope and covered with a thin mattress stuffed with dry grass and a single threadbare wool blanket. Two ghosts under one roof. He, the ghost of a soldier who had forsaken his duty. She, the ghost of a people he had wronged, now lying broken in his care. He worked with a grim, focused desperation. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it blazed, casting flickering shadows that danced like tormented spirits on the walls. He heated water in his only pot, the metal scarred and blackened from years of use. With a strip of clean linen torn from his own shirt, he began to clean the wound. It was worse than he had feared. A long, deep slice along her ribs, clean and deliberate. It wasn't a wound from a fall or an animal. It was a knife's work, meant not to kill quickly, but to maim, to terrorize. As he worked, his hands gentle. But sure, he saw other marks on her skin. Faint, silvery scars on her forearms, arranged in patterns that spoke of ritual, of identity. These were not the marks of violence, but of belonging. They made the fresh wound all the more profane. She remained unconscious, lost in some deep internal landscape of fever and pain. He was grateful for her silence. He did not know what he would say to her if she woke. What apology could possibly suffice? I am sorry that my people are monsters. I am sorry that I stood by while they burned your world. The words were ash in his mouth. His own wound was invisible, a shard of memory lodged deep in his heart. The memory of that day in the valley. The order had come down from a major drunk. On whiskey and manifest destiny, clear the valley. No hostiles remaining. They had ridden in at dawn. Jonas had seen the lodges, the smoke from the morning fires, the shapes of women moving about their work, the distant laughter of children. He had seen his fellow soldiers draw their sabers, their faces set in masks of grim resolve or feverish excitement. And he had reined in his horse, his stomach turning to ice. He had not charged. He had sat there, a statue of insubordination. As the wave of blue crashed into the village, the screams that followed were the soundtrack to his nightmares. He saw a man, a leader by his bearing, with a single eagle feather in his hair, step out of a lodge, a bow in his hand, not to fight, but to shield the entrance. He saw the flash of a dozen carbines, and the man fell, a broken doll on the trampled earth. Jonas had turned his horse and ridden away, the brand of coward seared onto his back by the glares of his comrades, the cheers of victory mingling with the wails of the dying. Now a girl from those same people lay in his bed. Was she the daughter of the man with the eagle feather? A sister? A niece? The possibility was a cold stone in his gut. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. He nursed her with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. He made a poultice from yarrow and willow bark, remedies learned from a woman he had loved long ago, a healer whose gentle hands he had abandoned for the false promise of glory. In the West, he brewed teas from pine needles to ward off the fever. He dribbled broth between her lips, a meager offering of rabbit and root vegetables. He took the blue cavalry coat she had been found with, and without ceremony, buried it deep in the snow behind his cabin. He buried it like a corpse, a final, futile attempt to sever himself from the man he had been. When he came back inside, he saw that she was awake. She was sitting up, her dark eyes fixed on the fire. She did not look at him. She stared into the flames as if she were seeing something else entirely, a burning lodge, a world turned to ash. There was no gratitude in her gaze, no fear. Only a profound, unnerving stillness. They existed in a world without words. The silence in the small cabin was immense, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. It was a heavy, charged silence, a space where their two solitudes clashed and recoiled. He would offer her a bowl of stew, and she would accept it with a slow, deliberate nod, her eyes never leaving the fire. He would add a log to the hearth, and she would flinch, a barely perceptible tremor running through her. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the world outside turned a deep, bruised purple, she moved. She slid off the cot and knelt before the hearth. With a slender finger, she began to draw in the gray ash that had spilled onto the stone floor. She drew a circle, then a series of lines radiating from it like the legs of a spider. Inside the circle, she drew a single stylized feather. Then she drew a horse, its head bowed in sorrow. And finally, she drew a shape that made the blood freeze in Jonas's veins. A man in a wide-brimmed hat, holding a long rifle. She was telling a story, her story. And he was a character in it, whether he wanted to be or not. He watched, mesmerized, his heart a cold, heavy knot in his chest. When she was finished, she looked up, not at him, but towards the single small window of the cabin. A low sound began to emanate from her throat, a soft, mournful hum. It was not a song of pain, but something else. A song of calling. A prayer sent out into the vast listening silence. It was not a hum meant for him, it was for someone else. For someone who was coming. A deep, primal fear, colder than the Wyoming wind, settled over him. He had not saved her. He had only delayed the inevitable. He had taken her from the hunters, but now he realized with a terrifying certainty her people were coming for her. And for him, the quiet was over. The storm was about to break. The first sign was the silence. Not the usual quiet of the wilderness, which was always filled with the subtle hum of life, but a dead, profound stillness. The wind died. The chittering of squirrels in the pines ceased. Even the ever-present hawk was gone from the sky. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jonas felt it before he saw it. A pressure change in the air, a weight, a presence. He rose from his stool, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt, a useless gesture against what he knew was coming. He moved to the small, grimy window and peered out. The world was shrouded in a thick pre-dawn fog, a ghostly white veil that clung to the trees and muffled all sound. For a moment he saw nothing. Then a shape coalesced out of the mist. A single rider on a pinto pony, sitting perfectly still, a rifle held across his lap. He was a sentinel, a statue carved from shadow and silence. He wore no war paint, only the grim patience of a man who has come to collect a debt. Jonas's blood ran cold. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm. He looked at the girl. She was still kneeling by the hearth, her back to him, her posture serene, as if she were waiting for expected guests. She had known. The humming had been a beacon. He forced himself to look out the window again. The single rider was no longer alone. Behind him, more shapes emerged from the fog, silent as ghosts. 10, then 20, then more. They were on foot and on horseback, a line of men that stretched across the clearing in front of his cabin. They were not warriors in the sense he remembered, not painted for battle, not shouting cries of war. They were simply there. Their presence was more terrifying than any army he had ever faced. It was the presence of history, of judgment, of a people who had come not to destroy, but to reclaim. The air grew thick with their collective gaze, a physical force that seemed to press in on the thin walls of the cabin. Jonas felt impossibly small, an intruder in a sacred space he had desecrated. Then the line of men parted. A man on foot emerged, walking with a slow, deliberate gait. He was older, his face a mask of deeply etched lines, a roadmap of sorrow and wisdom. His long, gray-streaked hair was bound in 2 braids wrapped in otter fur. He wore a simple buckskin shirt adorned with intricate quill work. He did not carry a weapon. His power was not in what he held, but in who he was. At his side, his hand, resting on the shoulder of a young boy of about 10, was a sign of both continuity and authority. This was a leader, a chief, a man who held the fate of his people in his hands. The man stopped directly in front of the cabin door, his dark eyes seeming to pierce through the wood and pin Jonas to the floor. The world went utterly, terrifyingly quiet. Every heartbeat in Jonas's chest was a clap of thunder. He could feel the girl's stillness behind him, a calm at the center of the hurricane. Time stretched, became brittle. Jonas knew he could not hide. To wait for them to break down the door would be an act of defiance, an admission of guilt and fear. He had to face them. He had to answer for what he had done, not just in the past few days, but in the lifetime of shame that had led him here. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. The cold air hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the threshold, blinking in the gray light, facing the silent assembly. He saw dozens of faces, all turned towards him. They were hard faces, unforgiving faces, faces that had seen too much loss. The old man, the leader, took a step forward. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of the mountains, the rumble of distant thunder. He spoke in Lakota, the words sharp and clear in the frozen air. The young boy at his side, his eyes wide but steady, translated. His voice thin but precise. He asks why you have her. Jonas's own voice was a dry rasp. She was wounded, bleeding. I found her by the creek. The old man listened to the translation, his expression unchanging. He spoke again, another short, sharp burst of language. The boy translated. He says you are Waziku. He says your people do not help. They take. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and true. It was the story of 100 years of broken treaties and stolen land, of massacres and forced marchers. It was the story of the blue coat Jonas had buried in the snow. I am not like them, Jonas said, the words tasting like a lie even to his own ears. The old man's eyes narrowed. He said something longer this time, his voice laced with a cold, hard anger. The boy's translation was halting, as if the words themselves were heavy. He says the last time men who looked like you came to their valley, they left only fire and widows. He says you wear the same face as the men who killed his brother. Jonas felt the ground drop out from beneath him. The man with the eagle feather. This was his brother. The girl, she was his niece, the daughter of the man he had watched die. And then the old man spoke the final damning sentence, a statement of fact that was also a verdict. The boy's voice was barely a whisper. He says, he touched one of ours. There was nothing left to say, no defense to offer. No excuse that could bridge the chasm of blood and history between them. Jonas looked past the chief, at the silent ranks of men, at the weight of their collective grief and rage. He was not their prisoner. He was their reckoning. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped out of the cabin, leaving the doorway open. He walked a few paces into the snow, and then, in an act not of fear, but of profound and soul-shattering atonement, he dropped to one knee, bowing his head before the man he had wronged so deeply. He offered no resistance. He offered only his life, a paltry sum for the debt he owed. They did not bind him. They did not strike him. The chief, the girl's uncle, simply gestured with his chin, and two of the silent men moved to Jonas's side. Their hands on his arms were not rough but firm, an inescapable gravity. They led him away from his cabin, towards the center of the assembled men. The others parted to let them through, their eyes following him, a silent, burning inquest. He was taken to the edge of the clearing, near the dense stand of pines, and left to stand, flanked by his two guards. The chief walked to the cabin door and paused, looking inside. Jonas saw him speak to the girl, his voice now gentle, a tone reserved for family, for the beloved. After a moment, she emerged, wrapped in the wool blanket from Jonas's cot. She looked small and fragile in the gray morning light, but her chin was held high. She walked to her uncle's side, and for the first time, she looked directly at Jonas. Her expression was unreadable, a deep, still water that hid its secrets. The chief, Hoka the Badger Man, as Jonas would later learn his name was, a name that spoke of his tenacity, his ferocity in defense of his own, turned his attention back to Jonas. He began to speak, his voice once again the low rumble of authority, the boy translating every word. This was not a conversation, it was a trial. My niece, Anpa Wikapi, she who is the Dawn Star, tells me you gave her water. You cleaned her wound, you gave her your bed. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. She says you buried the blue coat. Jonas could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. She also says, Hoka continued, his eyes like ships of obsidian, that she saw you in a dream vision 2 winters ago. She saw the day the soldiers came. She saw the smoke and heard the screams. She saw her father fall. And she saw a man on a horse, separate from the others, a man who did not charge, a man whose face was a mask of shame. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jonas stared at the girl, Anpa Wikapi. She had seen him, she had remembered him, not as a killer, but as the one who had refused, the one who had watched. His inaction, his great sin, had been witnessed not as cowardice, but as something else, something she had held on to. When the hunters found her 2 days ago, Hoka went on, his voice a relentless current. The ones who trail the herds, the whiskey men with dead eyes, they hurt her. They left her for dead. She crawled to the creek and she prayed, not for rescue, but for the spirit of the man with the shamed face to find peace. And then you appeared. Jonas felt a tremor run through him, a shock of understanding so profound. It was almost painful. Their meeting had not been an accident. It had been an answer to a prayer. She had not been saved by him, but in some way she had summoned him. He was a piece of her story, a loose thread she had now woven back into the tapestry. My niece has the sight, Hoka stated, not as a boast, but as a simple, undeniable fact. She sees the threads that connect men to their deeds. She says the wound you carry is older and deeper than hers. She says you came to this place to die. I came here to be forgotten, Jonas whispered, the words finally breaking free. The translation was unnecessary. The tone was universal. Hoka took a step closer, his presence immense. No man can be forgotten by the land he has scarred. You cannot erase your footprints from the snow by wishing them away. You must walk a new path. He looked from Jonas to his niece, and back again. She says you are not a wolf. You are a dog who has lost its master and forgotten the sound of its own name. The description was so stark, so accurate, it stole the air from Jonas's lungs. That was what he was. A stray, haunted by the memory of a command he had both obeyed and defied. We have a law, Hoka said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, dangerous. Blood for blood. A hand that harms one of the people must be forfeit. The men who did this to her, he gestured to Anpa Wikapi's side, we will find them. Their debt will be paid in full. But your debt, Your debt is older, deeper. It is not the debt of a knife, but of a ghost. What does a man pay for a crime of the soul? Jonas looked at the faces around him, at the decades of pain and loss reflected in their eyes. He thought of the man with the eagle feather, of the life he had watched be extinguished. He thought of the girl, this dawn star, who had carried his image in her memory for 2 years. There was only one payment possible. "My life," Jonas said, his voice clear and steady. He looked directly into Hoka Vikasa's eyes. "It is all I have left to give." He expected an affirmation, a nod, the swift justice of a knife or a war club. He had begged for punishment, for the release of a final violent absolution. Instead, Hoka Vikasa was silent for a long moment. He looked at his niece, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he looked back at Jonas, and a flicker of something unreadable, not pity, not mercy, but something far more complex passed through his eyes. "A life is easy to take," Hoka Vikasa said, the boy translating with renewed speed. "It is a moment's work. A life lived in service, that is a heavier price. We will not take your life from you. We will give you one." He turned and gave a sharp command. 2 men broke from the circle and began to prepare a fire in the center of the clearing. They worked with practiced efficiency, building a pyre of dry pine and sage. A fire, the symbol of both destruction and purification. Jonas watched, his mind reeling. They were not going to kill him. They were going to do something else. Something he could not begin to comprehend. The fire blazed, a roaring pillar of orange and gold against the gray sky, sending plumes of scented smoke spiraling into the heavens. The heat was a living thing, pushing back the biting cold. The men of the tribe formed a wide circle around it, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames, their expressions solemn and unreadable. The world outside this ring of fire and humanity ceased to exist. There was only the crackle of burning pine, the hiss of melting snow, and the low, rhythmic beat of a single hand drum that had begun to sound from somewhere in the circle. Hoka Vikasa led his niece, Anpa Wikapi, towards the fire. She was no longer wrapped in Jonas's blanket. She wore a new dress of the finest, softest doeskin, adorned with intricate quillwork that depicted stars and dragonflies. Her hair was freshly braided, woven with strands of sweetgrass. The gash in her side had been cleaned and dressed with their own medicine, covered by a poultice of herbs held in place by a soft leather binding. She was no longer a victim. She was transformed, reborn. Jonas watched from his place between the 2 guards, his heart a confusion of fear and awe. He assumed this was a ritual for her, a ceremony of cleansing and survival. He believed he was merely a witness, a condemned man forced to observe the sacred rites of the people. He had wronged before his own fate was decided. Hoka Vikasa raised his hands, and the drum fell silent. He began to speak, his voice a powerful chant that rose and fell with the cadence of ancient prayer. He spoke of the girl's lineage, of her father, the warrior Tatankapaha Buffalo Hill, who now walked the spirit road. He spoke of her survival, of the vision that had connected her to the man with the shamed face. He spoke of debts, of blood, and of the sacred circle of life, which when broken, must be mended. As he spoke, Anpa Wikapi walked slowly around the fire. She moved with a grace that belied her injury. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but her path was sure. She was not a girl anymore. She was a woman, forged in violence and vision, stepping into her power. Jonas braced himself. He thought this was a prelude to his end. A funeral for her father, followed by the execution of one of the men who had stood by. He tried to find a place of peace within himself, to accept the justice of it. Then, Hoka Vikasa's gaze fell upon him. He gestured, a sharp, commanding motion. The guards propelled Jonas forward, out of the shadows and into the intense flickering light of the fire. He stumbled, his eyes watering from the smoke and heat, and found himself standing opposite the girl, the roaring flames between them. "You offered us your life," Hoka voice boomed, translated by the boy who now stood at his side. "We do not accept. A dead man cannot repay a debt. A dead man cannot guard a gate, or mend a fence, or keep watch in the night." He turned to his niece. "Anpao Wikapi, has this man earned a name?" She looked across the fire at Jonas, her gaze steady and clear. For the first time, he saw not a victim, not a mystic, but a judge. She held his life in her hands. She spoke a single word, her voice ringing with a surprising strength. "How?" "Yes," Hoka nodded. "Then a name shall be given." He beckoned Jonas to come around the fire. Hesitantly, Jonas obeyed, his boots crunching on the snow. He walked until he stood before the chief and the girl. The entire tribe watched, their silence a tangible thing. "You knelt before us in shame," Hoka said, looking down at Jonas. "You offered your neck. This is the way of your people, to bow before power, hoping for mercy. Our way is different. We ask you to stand. A man cannot carry a burden." On his knees, Jonas forced himself to stand straight, to meet the chief's gaze. "You are no longer the man who rode with the blue coats. You are no longer the ghost hiding on this mountain. That man died when you chose to carry my niece from the creek. Today, we give you a new skin." Hoka reached out and with his thumb, smeared a line of ash from the fire onto Jonas's forehead. It was not a mark of condemnation, but of consecration. "You stood between the hunters and the hunted. You were a shield where there was none. You were a stone that diverted the flood. Therefore, your name shall be Inyab Nazlu, stone that diverts." The name settled over Jonas, not as a crown, but as a weight, a burden, a purpose. It was not a name of honor earned in battle, but a name of service, born from a single act of grace. Then, the moment that shattered his world occurred. Anpao Wikapi, the dawn star, stepped forward. She, who had every right to hate him, to demand his death, looked up at him. And in an act of breathtaking, irrational mercy, she reached up and placed her small, warm hand on the side of his head, her fingers brushing against his hair. It was not a gesture of possession or affection. It was a gesture of acceptance, of peace. It was forgiveness, not for him, but for the possibility of what he could become. The world held its breath. In that single touch, a bridge was built across a chasm of blood. It was not a bridge of forgetting, but of acknowledgement. A recognition that a new path was possible, even on land scarred by old wounds. Hoka spoke a final time, his voice softer now, a low murmur meant for Jonas alone. "This is not a gift, in Yagnaslu, it is a chain. Her life is now tied to yours. Her safety is your purpose. You will live here, at the edge of our lands. You will be a watcher on the wall, a buffer between our world and the one that sends its monsters into our sacred places. You will owe us your eyes, your strength, and your silence. This is your price. This is your life." It was not a marriage. It was not an adoption. It was something else, something for which his language had no word. It was a sacred, irreversible binding. He was being given not a reward, but a role. He was to become a guardian, a sentinel, an anchor point between two worlds that should never have collided. He did not return to his life of solitude. That life had been burned away in the ceremonial fire. He stayed. His cabin, once a hermitage of shame, became a guard post. He did not join the tribe. He did not live in their village in the valley below. He remained on his ridge, a man caught between worlds, a permanent fixture on the borderland. His name, Jonas, faded like a whisper on the wind, replaced by the one they had given him. In Yagnaslu, stone that diverts, he learned the rhythms of their lives from a distance. He learned the signs of the seasons in the movement of their herds. He watched their children grow, saw the smoke from their ceremonial fires, and heard the faint echo of their drums on the night air. He became their eyes to the east, to the world of Waziku. He would watch the trails for the telltale signs of prospectors, of hunters, of the blue-coated soldiers who still patrolled the edges of the territory. When he saw them, he would make a simple signal, a fire with green pine branches that sent a column of thick, white smoke into the sky. A warning. It was his duty, his sole purpose. Ampau Wikapi thrived. He would see her sometimes from a distance when she came to the high meadows with the other women to gather herbs. She moved with the confidence of one who had faced death and chosen to live. She never spoke to him, never approached his cabin. The touch she had given him by the fire had been the last. It was all that was needed. Their bond was not one of conversation, but of shared existence. He was her shield, and she was his purpose. Years passed. The lines on his face deepened, carved not by regret, but by the wind and the sun. His hair grew long and gray. He spoke little, his silence becoming a form of prayer. He was a man whittled down to his essence, his new name the only truth he had left. One autumn, a new threat came. Not soldiers, but railroad men, with their measuring chains and their iron stakes, plotting a course for their steel serpent straight through the tribe's sacred hunting grounds in the valley. Inyagnaslu gave his warning smoke, but this time it was not enough. The railroad men had government papers and armed guards. Hoka Vakasa came to him, his face grim. They will not be turned aside by warnings, stone that diverts. They see only lines on a map. Jonas, Inyagnaslu, looked down at the valley, at the small figures of the surveyors driving stakes into the earth. He looked at the tribe that had given him a life when they should have given him a grave. He did not die at their hands, he died defending them. When the armed guards of the railroad came to clear the valley, they found a lone white man standing in their path, a rifle in his hands, his face set like stone. He did not fire a shot to kill. He fired to warn, to delay, to divert. He stood as a shield, just as his name decreed. He fell under a volley of rifle fire, his body crumpling onto the land he had sworn to protect. His sacrifice bought the tribe time to send riders to Fort Laramie, time to plead their case with an agent who, moved by the story of a white man dying for a Lakota treaty, argued on their behalf. The railroad was rerouted. The valley was spared. They brought his body back to the clearing in front of his cabin. They did not bury him in their own way, but they honored him in theirs. They wrapped him in a fine buffalo robe and placed him on a scaffold high in the pines facing the west, towards the setting sun. Ampau Wikapi, now a woman grown, a leader among her people, stood before the scaffold. She did not weep. She looked at the still form of the man who had been a ghost, a stray, and finally, a shield. She spoke to the fire they had lit for him, her voice carrying on the wind, a final epitaph etched into the memory of the land itself. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.